You may be seated. Leonard Cohen once said that his ordinary state of mind is like the waiting room at the DMV. I actually think I know what he means. I know what he means because I know a lot about DMVs. In the early years of our marriage, you see, Ardell and I tended to buy vehicles that were near the end of their useful life, you might say. And mind you, I now drive a 1996 Chevy S10 pickup given to me by someone who couldn't even give it away to NPR, so when I say we used to buy cars near the end of their lives, we do know what the end looks like. The point here, though, is that turnover was fairly high in our driveway, so I spent a lot of time at the DMV. I can still see the dirty blonde paneling, the posters listing the 75 or 80 items required for the registration process. Rows of metal chairs were arranged courtroom style, facing two desks where a couple of somber clerks sat all day long, shuffling through the paperwork of the inept, people who hadn't brought proof of insurance or a signed bill of sale or an inspection sticker. Remember those sensible days when we actually thought a licensed car should be roadworthy? Anyway, each of us held this plastic number, right, that we'd taken from that hook by the door, but with the anticipation that our number might actually be eventually called. Dread would build as well. We knew that our moment, when it came, we'd probably be sent empty away again. Maybe to fetch a note from the doctor or pay a fine for an overdue library book. I mean, you really needed to have your life in order in those days to license a car. So yeah, my ordinary state of mind is a little bit like that. Like the waiting room at the DMV. Thoughts, worries, wishes, regrets, they line up all day long, impatiently waiting their turn for my attention. My computer flashes announcements of urgent emails to be answered, Facebook posts that apparently involve me, calendar obligations coming my way. There's a lot of restlessness and noise in the waiting room of my mind sometimes, and it can keep me from being present to the moment at hand. Well, what if there's something or someone in the silence beneath all that noise that a person might learn to rest in? A silence one might learn to trust. On some days, it's not so hard to see why Leonard Cohen, this Sabbath-keeping Jewish songwriter, became a Buddhist monk at the age of 62, but that's probably not in the cards for most of us. I wonder if there's a more excellent way that's a little more doable. Now, if you're expecting this preacher to be some kind of Zen master who is going to explain how to mend your life over the course of a sermon, you'll be disappointed. But I do think there's some relevant wisdom for us, even for us, in the bloody and bizarre story of Elijah in his cave. Maybe we should place the story in context. The story that just precedes it's one you might remember from Sunday school when you were a kid. It's the one in which Elijah goes head-to-head with the prophets of Baal and basically comes off looking like LeBron. Remember that one? A drought's underway. Elijah tells Ahab that he can take care of this thing, and he challenges all these other prophets to a duel. Whoever lights the sacrificial bull with fire from the sky wins. Baal's prophets can't even call down a spark, so Elijah taunts them like a schoolboy, and then pours water all over the bull and the altar and into the trench he's dug around it just for kicks. And when he prays, so much fire comes from heaven that it burns up not just the bull, but the wood and the stones and the dust and licks the water out from the trench. Great Old Testament stuff, right? Well, it is that Elijah, so recently secured the position of bold prophet not to be messed with, who is suddenly running scared from Jezebel and hiding out in a cave. He hears the voice of God at the door, and it says, I kind of love this part, what are you doing here, Elijah? Nice welcome to Sinai, right? So Elijah explains, as we do. I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they're seeking my life to take it away. And God apparently has nothing to say about all that. Nothing at all. God just says, all right, go stand on the mountain. I'm about to pass by. Then came a wind that splits rocks and mountains, but God wasn't in it. Then came an earthquake, but God was not in it. Then came a fire. Remember the fire and the great big prophet smackdown? God wasn't in the fire either. And then came the sound of sheer silence. Elijah covers his face, presumably because God was in this silence somehow. And here may be the strangest part of the story. After all this spectacle, nothing really changes in Elijah at all. God asks all over again, "So why are you here, prophet?" And Elijah gives the same explanation verbatim about how zealous he's been for God, how lame the people of Israel are. And God says, "All right, go on. Return on your way to Damascus. I've got a few kings I need you to anoint." The ways of God are very strange, but the mind of Elijah is so familiar to me in a way. It's the DMV, right? Elijah's out being impressive and successful as a prophet can be. He's winning so much we're tired of his winning. But the thrill of it all empties in no time like adrenaline. And the vacuum left in his mind fills with fear and annoyance and a whole bunch of explanations to God about how things really ought to be. It's all those thoughts of self-justification that sound a lot like the waiting room in my head. They line up and demand their turn for attention. They claim to have all their paperwork together. This world is supposed to be a morally orderly place, right? The good prophets win. The bad ones get what's coming to them. That's supposed to be the theology of the Hebrew Scriptures. Keep the covenant, all will be well. If you don't, look out. There will be smiting. But story after story in the Old Testament seems to begin with these assumptions and then subverts them. Elijah's stellar prophetic performance is interrupted. It's interrupted by the sound of silence and the notion that God may be all the more present when the activity in our lives stops. And we're not so sure we can go on than when we're calling down fire and apparently at the top of our spiritual game. Now, it all seems wrong to offer an explanation to this story since Elijah's explanations are what fall so entirely flat. But it does seem that when my mind is most want explanations, God offers silence. Or when my mind shows up with the best things I've done as a dad or a priest or a Christian, producing my validating paperwork to God, once I finally get to the front of the line, God seems to say, "What are you doing here? Please review the list on the wall. I'm actually not all that interested in your successes. I tend to show up in silences and on crosses." A few years ago, back in Little Rock, I visited a friend whose severe schizophrenia had sent him into a psychiatric hospital again. And I'd prayed for years that God would stop the earthquakes and the rock-breaking winds in his mind, but God had not. Not for good at least. What do we do with this kind of divine silence? The silence of God in our lives when that suffering goes unhealed or injustice continues unchecked. Well, the story of Elijah in the cave may actually provide one difficult possibility. Sometimes maybe we just sit in it. We just wrap our face in our mantles and we just keep still, at least for a time. We probably won't get answers, but we may get a presence. Look around at a funeral wake or a vigil. Are you ever more certain that life is sacred, if a vulnerable gift? It's often in these silences when all the explanations feel like betrayals that maybe the DMV in our heads really finally closes and we're present to the moment at hand, hurting but awake, grieving, somehow grateful at once, grateful at least for the goodness that's just been lost. My friend and I sat there in the psych ward looking out the room's great big plate glass windows into the blistering heat of the city. Maybe it was the meds, or the air conditioning, or the grace of God, or some just so combination of all three. But Daryl got a break from the noise in his head for a second. He looked down at my feet and said, Hey, preacher. He called me preacher. Hey, preacher, did you get some new shoes? I hadn't. The shoes were actually pretty old, but he liked them. And the storms in his head calmed enough to enjoy this one thing on the outside and to make it known. I like those shoes, he said. Those are good-looking shoes. And he laughed. We got no answers, no explanations in that moment. It was just really more silence from God. The violence and the suffering of the world went on as it does. But one person whose paranoia keeps him mostly cut off from the moment at hand and the reality outside his own head got a little free for a second. The DMV closed down, and the world beyond it opened up just a bit, and it was good. I like those shoes. It seemed like a hurricane of grace just then. And somehow, it was grace enough to help me believe all over again that the sheer silence of a loving God really does exist beneath each unfolding moment, holding the strange miracle of our lives in being, and that maybe God's silence isn't something just to be feared or avoided or explained away, but something we can actually learn to just sit still, even for one healing moment within.